Hi everybody, and welcome to this Open Source Central webinar, the first in a series of webinars all about open source. Today we're going to be talking about an introduction to open source software governance. My name is Louise Stebbings, and I'm the EMEA Marketing Manager at Flexera. So we're hosting the webinar today, and we have a guest speaker from Source Code Control, who I'll introduce in a second. But before I do that, I just want to run through some housekeeping. So most of you will have been logged onto this and be listening to this through your computer speakers. If the sound quality isn't good enough, or if it deteriorates during the webinar, in most cases this can be solved by just refreshing your browser. If this doesn't help, the main method of communication with us is via the chat function. So if you're experiencing any technical issues, just pop a question into the chat function and we'll help you straight away with that. We'll respond back via the chat window. So this webinar will last for approximately 60 minutes, and there'll be two speakers. We'll be answering questions at the end, but as questions occur to you, do pop them into the chat function. I'll be making a note of those, and we'll circle back to those at the end of the webinar. And finally, we will be sending you a link to a recording of this webinar. That will come after the 28th of March, but I will also make sure that you get a copy of the slides within 24 hours of this presentation. So today, I'd like to introduce your speakers. We will have Martin Callanan, Director and Founder of Source Code Control, some open source risk management specialist based in the United Kingdom. But before Martin talks to us today, I'd like to hand over to Fito Michael. He's a Senior Solution Engineer at Flexera, and Fito will introduce today's topic. So Fito, it's over to you.
Thank you, Louise. So welcome everybody. Basically, we're just going to run through an introduction to open source governance and how really manage the vulnerability and compliance issues around that process. So a lot of organizations use open source now in a day-to-day basis, if not all organizations. And data really comprises of up to 50% of total assets within organizations. To manage those effectively, it really helps you protect your organization and your development processes to be safer and to be more compliant and really reduce the risk to your organizations. A lot of this source code comes in from the supply chain. Not many things are done purely in-house. They're all brought in from different organizations, subcontractors, consultants, and really to understand that supply chain and to make sure it's safe and secure is really a key priority based on how it operates. The key thing, in my opinion, is to understand and know what's in your code. The rest of it is pure data around that. If you understand what your bill of materials is made up of, what code is contained within your products, it really helps you mitigate the risks that you're introducing into those, both for your suppliers and the buyers of that source code. It's really a lot of open source and third-party components on the market today are being used in many different products, many different organizations, and the compliance around those, whether it be a security perspective or a license perspective, really are the same. It's about understanding what it is. Developers use different tools, different strategies. They go home, they work on things from home, and really it's a prevalent industry around the source code that's being developed. They've been developed for different platforms, open source stacks that are being developed by a lot of organizations. A lot of major organizations are also being involved in the production of these. So really it's making sure that the leverage of that open source component is really being utilized to its full ability. And there's been some high profile sort of newsworthy cases. You see at the bottom, the Chase and the Equifax Act. They're really a direct result of unpatched open source components that were brought into the development tools without really the understanding of what it is they had in those products. So compliance issues are becoming headline. I mean, we looked at, if we go back a few years, you had the Poodle, the Heartbleed. They didn't really have that much legalities around those. It was more about the vulnerability based on those. But what we're seeing now is more legal headlines making the news. So a federal court in the US has now ruled that open source licenses are enforceable in court, and they are enforceable contracts. We're seeing high profile court cases go through, the GoKinetic one being one of them for $100 million for a GPL violation. They're basically getting bigger. So the vulnerability around those, you need to really manage what they are. You know, there's over 5 billion different downloads on an annual basis, over 2 billion projects. There's so many forges available, different open source licenses, and the security vulnerability ratio is now 1 in 18. And that comes directly from Black Hat in the US. So all of that together, it basically creates a risk. It's a risk that needs to be managed. Whether you're supplying software or buying software, it's really an understanding of what that is. So I'm going to hand over to Martin at this point to basically go through the different kind of supply chain and the process around how to move that forward in a manageable way.
Thanks, Vito. Hello, everybody. So for the next part of the presentation, I'm going to focus on less about issues, but more about how do you manage open source. And what I'm really going to focus on is what is the latest industry best practice, so collaborative input into how to manage open source software. Then I'm going to talk about practical ways to take those best practices and implement them within your organization. And I'll finish off with a bit of a case study or example of how we've worked with an organization to implement some of those best practices and the benefit they're getting from them. Now, one of the challenges we face and companies that we work with face is, up until recently, there's been no central guidance of best practices of how to manage open source software. There's loads of information, websites, organizations like the Free Software Foundation, Open Source Initiative, Software Freedom Conservancy, all with loads of information on their websites, always presented at events. There's initiatives like SPDX, Software Packet Data Exchange from the Linux Foundation, and various other initiatives globally. But the challenge is you find yourself going around in circles trying to find answers to questions around how to manage open source. Fortunately, there is a movement to address that situation, which is what I'm going to focus on. But as an example, we've been trying to engage with standards bodies. So in the UK, there's the British Standards Institute, which is globally recognised as a standards body. They publish standards in various different disciplines. And we do work in the health sector, as you'll see at the end. And they produced a code of practice for software developments in health and wellness apps. And it's a 26-page document, and there's literally one sentence talking about potential open source risk and risk in open source components. It doesn't really define what that risk is, and more importantly, it doesn't tell you how you should manage that risk or what you could adopt to manage that risk. So what's been happening in the last couple of years, the Linux Foundation has incubated a project called OpenChain. And the chain refers to the supply chain of software, so all the components coming into software, all the way through to you shipping software, which is then used and becomes part of the supply chain. So it's basically the recommended processes for managing that supply chain and minimizing risk. Now, it's focused on license compliance. However, some of the principles which I'll touch on, you can extend to include security vulnerabilities to address some of the issues that Vito mentioned. Now, this is a collaborative project. A number of organizations and individuals who are heavily invested in open source, so people like Toyota, Qualcomm, Western Digital, smaller organizations, and this collaborative team is getting bigger and bigger all the time. You can sign up and become a collaborator of it, as it evolves. We're on version 1.2 at the moment. So each organisation has their own way of managing open source, and what we try to do with OpenChain is to consolidate that into a consistent way of managing a supply chain. So what it's trying to address is any organisation leveraging open source, whether you're developing software or acquiring software, is that you can trust the software in that's part of that supply chain. And the whole point of open source, or the whole benefits of open source, is this collaboration drives efficiency and transparency. Now you, as an individual, or your organisations individually, could have the best practices that you can think of. You could have invested money in tools, you could have great legal advice, but you still rely on third parties for software coming into your software. So developers using libraries, components. If those components have come from projects which haven't got as good rigor as you have in your process, then you've still got to invest time and become inefficient managing and addressing issues in that code. So what OpenChain is trying to do is to get broad adoption of a standard way of managing open source, which then drives more trust in the software, less investment of time checking software because you know how it's managed in the supply chain, which drives more collaboration and more efficiency. So everybody should benefit from that. So there are three main pillars to OpenChain. At the heart of OpenChain is what's known as specification. This is basically a set of requirements, but if you adopt these requirements and you've got these processes for these requirements in your organization, then you have a good process for managing the obligations of license compliance when you're shipping software that includes open source components, libraries, or you license under an open source license. Now, the next thing is conformance. So what you can do is currently you can do a self-assessment. So you can download an assessment questionnaire from the OpenChain website, and you can go through and check how your current processes stack up and your level of understanding stacks up in your organization for managing open source. If you believe that you address all those issues, then you can go through a self-assessment and get recognized by the OpenChain and the Linux Foundation as having conformed with OpenChain, and you get a logo that you can use on your website or in your code, whatever you want to do with that. And the third element is a curriculum. So everybody's got together and created a training course, which is licensed under a Creative Commons license. So it's a basic curriculum to educate individuals and organizations of how to manage open source. And I'll talk about that in a bit more detail as we go through that. Then hopefully, obviously there will be multiple steps in a supply chain. Hopefully, if an inbound supplier of open source software or components or libraries is conformant with OpenChain, comes into software that you're developing, and you've got your OpenChain processes, you've got a policy, your developers and related employees are trained in your policy and your processes, then when you ship your outbound software, for all intents and purposes, it should be compliant, conformant, and meeting the obligations required of licenses used in your software, including the license of your own software. So that is the theory. So OpenChain is pushing to get more and more organizations involved and getting people conforming to that, and eventually it will become a standard. So what we're going to focus on now is less about the theory, but more about how do you apply OpenChain. I'm going to talk about how we work with organizations to leverage OpenChain in a more practical way. Now, you've probably come across people, processes, and technology before. OpenChain in isolation is not the overall solution. For instance, there are requirements in OpenChain that you are able to identify all the components, third-party components, open source components, libraries that are used in your software and how they're licensed, and also be able to create all the documentation that you need. So there is a need for technology. So things like Code Insight with software composition analysis can give that data. That data feeds into the process. There's also the people element. It's no good just having one individual or a small number of individuals who understand the subject and a sole responsibility of one person to be asserting what's right and what's wrong. It's a collaborative effort. Large organisations, you're going to have all sorts of people involved, legal counsel, could be external legal counsel, developers, of course, CTOs, architects. So you create a team, and all that combination is the solution. And OpenChain, if you like, is the process that wraps it all together. Now, software composition analysis is important. Obviously, I've said it gives you the data about the components and how they're licensed, which is a requirement of OpenChain. But commercial tools can give you more data as well. So not only licensing and copyright statements, at the same time, identifying those components with tools like Code Insight, you can identify security vulnerabilities, you can identify how well supported those components are. So you can extend beyond the requirements of OpenChain, which is what I kind of touched on earlier. Now, most people that we engage with tend to feel that these sorts of reports, which are referred to as a bill of materials, which in a raw format are quite technical, are just for developments to identify issues and fix issues and reports within themselves. What we're finding, what we're working with companies to do is to make those reports more customer ready, if you like, and share those with customers, share those with potential customers, prospects, as a way of transparently demonstrating how you manage software, what's in your code. So obviously, if you've got loads of vulnerabilities, you won't be sharing this report. But it's quite beneficial if you're competing, for instance, in a commercial situation with a proprietary software solution. By definition, they can't share what's in their code, or they don't share what's in their code. The benefit of open source is transparency. And if you adopt OpenChain, you've got technology, if you do software composition analysis, you can share that and transparently demonstrate that. We're also finding the insurance industry, so software companies who take out cyber and IP insurance, they're getting wise to the fact that anybody developing software should be able to prove that they've got control over issues, so licensing, compliance, and security are two key issues. We're also seeing investors, companies either seeking investment or investors looking to invest in an organisation, looking for these types of reports. And also within a business, the ultimate issues are commercial business issues. So internal stakeholders may want visibility of what's going on in software development, for instance. And it is a problematic area. There's over 2,000 odd licenses, all with different obligations and requirements that have to be complied with, conflict with each other. There's hundreds of thousands of vulnerabilities which Vito talked on. And the end result is there's an increase of high-profile issues. There's an increase in legal activity enforcing open source licenses, which is understandable because open source has become mainstream. So we had cases like Equifax last year. That was a vulnerability in Apache Struts. In the UK, there was a local council, Gloucester Council fined £100,000 for a breach of data, which was an exploit of a vulnerability called Heartbleed, which is over 3 years old. So it just wasn't being maintained. There's also something else to consider as regards software composition analysis, and that is we're less than 100 days away from the implementation of GDPR. And there is a requirement, if you process data, to ensure you've got a level of security appropriate to risk, i.e. that you've got controls in place and you can prove you've got controls in place to manage security that won't breach data. So that's why this is all important. The whole governance piece is important, but the data piece is important as well. Now, going back to OpenChain, there are 5 main conformance areas. The first one is across your business, not just an individual, but across your business, do you understand open source responsibilities? Do you understand obligations of licenses and what's required if you start using those components in your software? Do you understand your responsibilities when you ship your software? Have you assigned responsibility either to individuals, or have you set up a team to achieve compliance with open source licenses? Do you review and approve contents, open source libraries and components? Do they fit in with your IP strategy, your business strategy? And when it comes to shipping software, are you shipping all the documentation and the artifacts required as an obligation of the licenses of the components you're using? So, for instance, if you are licensing under the GPL, you have to have an offer of sharing your source code. Pretty much every open source component, you're obliged to have license notices, and if you've modified any components, modification notices. So that all needs to be checked before you ship software, and then you ship the software with that documentation. And the final piece, which isn't relevant to everybody, but your projects may be a community project where you've got external developers from the community contributing to your project. Do you understand how that all works? Things like contributor license agreements. Or the flip side of it is, maybe you allow developers to contribute to external projects, maybe contributing to the Linux kernel or things like CloudStack. And then there's requirements if you do that. Developers have to sign things like a contributor license agreement. Do they sign that as a representative of your organization, or are they doing that personally? So these are the key areas that you have to prove you can conform with to be OpenChain conformant. Now, the best starting point is with training. So I mentioned this curriculum has been produced, and it's under a Creative Commons license. And it presumes no knowledge, and it starts from the basics of intellectual property through to the basics of open source licenses, introduction to open source compliance, and then it moves into more about the solution, the end-to-end compliance management, and typical things that go wrong in an open source management or governance program. And we've wrapped around this. So number 8 in this list, we depending on the situation, we'd have a bit of a workshop with people about how to implement OpenChain and go through some of the things I'm about to show you now. But what we do find with training, it's people realise maybe they've got a sketchy understanding or a partial understanding of open source licenses, or no knowledge at all, or presumptions which are inaccurate, and definitely across a mix of people in an organisation. So, for instance, we just delivered a course. We had procurement because the organisation was procuring external software developed for them. We had legal. We had various solution architects. We had R&D. We had software asset managers. And each individual had a pocket of knowledge, but that knowledge didn't transfer across the organisation. So if you're looking to start a project, then training is a great starting point for that, to get a fundamental understanding of the basics of managing open source. Now, those 5 pillars, and I said you can download a questionnaire from the OpenChain website, which covers the areas you need to conform with. The way we work with clients is, first of all, we like to have a helicopter view of where a client's at, or anybody we're working with. So what we've done is taken, you can see these columns in this Trello board. We've taken all the areas that are required, and for each question we've created a Trello card. And what we do is we have companies assess themselves, so their opinion of how they believe they stack up against these questions. So and with the OpenChain questionnaire, it's very binary. It's either you conform or you don't conform. We believe there's a bit of a grey area where an organisation may partially conform. For instance, they may have a basic policy, but it's not good enough to conform with OpenChain. So we view that as partially conformance. We'll want to go through a journey from non-conformance to conformance and track how long it takes and have a history of what we've done. So we've got this Trello board, and that becomes the workings of a project management tool. So, for instance, each Trello board, when we're doing the assessments, you see this is one of the questions: do you have rules that govern FOSS license compliance for the supplied software distribution? So this is, do you have a policy, basically? And we would go through and assess. So in this example, there is work being done on a policy, and it's assigned to people or an individual. So we can see that's being worked on. You can set a due date of when that work's going to be completed, and also you can see the tasks as they're being progressed. So you can have multiple people collaborating on this. But you can see the labels we have. Rather than conformance, non-conformance, there's areas such as you're partially conform, needs improvements, not applicable. And we go through each question, and where there's non-conformance, we can start documenting what needs to be done, who's going to do that, and assign those tasks. So, if we go further on, for instance, this is where we've become conformance. So again, same question, but now we've gone through a number of steps. So we've got an open source review board, OSRB. We've gone through discussions, we've created a draft policy, and eventually it's been signed off. Now, the good thing about this is you can attach the documentation to this Trello board. So you can see multiple revisions, and you've got a reference point, a central reference point for everything about your project. You also link into, or you can link into things like Confluence and Jira, so you can create tickets and all sorts of things. But first of all, are we conformance? Yes. Can we prove a conformance? Yes, we can. Here's the documentation, and here's the steps we went through to get conformance. So one of the things the OpenChain team will be doing is, although you can self-assess, they will come in to you randomly and say, well, can you show us how you are conformance? Can you show us your policy? The idea is you've got a central repository with your whole project in there. So obviously that's very useful for document storage. And these documents are accessible, so I could download the policy. I might have editing rights. Maybe I'm the legal counsel. Maybe I'm head of development. And the policy should be a dynamic document. There's new licenses being used all the time, have to be assessed, and things like security issues need to be assessed and improved. So it's like a continuous improvement. So you can access that, upload a new version of the policy, and track the progress of that policy through to sign off and evolution beyond. And you can collaborate. So as I said, there's no point having just one individual in the organisation with an island of knowledge. You can start doing things like, so to be conformance, have you assigned an individual or a group of persons who are responsible? So larger organisations create what's known as an open source review board, which have multiple stakeholders. Smaller companies, maybe just one person. But you see here I've got attached a RACI chart. I can track my progress. So we've partially assigned a team, needs improvements. Maybe we need other representation from the other parts of the business. So then you can define your team, and then you can assign tasks from within the Trello board to members of your team or maybe external suppliers. And we touched on software composition analysis and the term bill of materials. So one of the requirements within OpenChain is, do you list all the FOSS components and their respective identified licenses from which supplied software is compromised? So basically this is a bill of materials. So there's technology like Code Insight that can produce a bill of materials. So again, you can attach the bill of materials. For every software release, you can attach a bill of materials. So you can have the history of all the releases of software and their bill of materials all in one place. You could also look at things like SPDX I've talked about. If you've got an SPDX file, so Software Packet Data Exchange, it's just a consistent way of tagging components and how they're licensed. So all that can be attached. So in this example, I'm saying we're fully compliant. So again, if somebody comes in and says, prove to me that you're compliant, I can just go into this Trello board. I can drill down onto this part of the assessment and say, well, here's our bill of materials by version, and also any other supplementary information that may be required. Now, as I said at this point, the requirement of OpenChain is to understand the licensing of components. But if you've got good quality software composition analysis at this point, you can also include security. You can have security management in your policy. So you can extend OpenChain beyond just license compliance, which drives even more confidence in the supply chain. And as I said, everything to do with the project, a centralized view of artifacts, proof of conformance. We talked about the policy. One of the requirements is that all staff, I think 88% of staff involved in software development need to be trained on open source governance and your policy. So you can create a training program. You can see here we've created a training program which is in draft format currently, as it's in progress and it's assigned. And also a training schedule, so a list of employees, who's been trained, who's not been trained. So you can use this to track onboarding of new developers, whether they're full-time heads or contractors, that they've been trained on the policy, they understand the requirements of your organization and how you manage software. So again, you've got a central store of that, and if anybody either internally or externally wants to validate your conformance, again, you can just drop into this and get that documentation. And again, things like bill of materials and maintaining compliance all can be seen within there as a central point. So that is kind of our take on a practical way to take the definition of OpenChain and apply it as a practical project and a project plan. I'm going to finish up with talking about how we've actually done this with an organisation in real life. So, and the benefits that they're reaping. So there's going to be a case study published about this in the next 2 weeks or so. It's just being written at the moment. So I mentioned earlier we do work in the health sector. So in the UK, NHS have an organisation called NHS Digital. So this is NHS England. They have an open source program which has been going for about 3 years called Code for Health. And I'll explain Code for Health in a moment, but you can feel free to obviously go to their website. Basically, it's a community of clinicians working with a community of software development individuals and organizations to create applications that actually work. The Aperta Foundation is related to this. It's a non-profit that provides governance in various areas around the applications coming out of Code for Health to drive confidence in the end user community. Now, Code for Health, NHS is primarily a public sector organisation, and the ethos is that anything developed should be in the public domain, and the NHS should not be locked into proprietary solutions that they can't move from. So the ethos is to have a library of assets which can be reused and can be supported by various different organisations. So as an example, what we are working with, one of their most mature solutions is called OpenEyes, which is an electronic health records application for eye care. And it was initially developed as an open source solution by Moorfields Eye Hospital in London. And it's been adopted by about 50 organisations around the world. There's various NHS organisations have adopted it. Now, they can take the source code. There's a third party that provides implementation services, support services for this. Now, if that third party organisation does a bad job of supporting that application, then they've still got the source code. They could have somebody else come in and support that. So it's not a rip and replace if they're not happy with their supplier. And also, each adopting organisation will have a slightly different requirement, and they can modify the source code and share that back to the community. So these communities cover different areas: eye care I mentioned, there's dementia, cancer, and so on and so on. And it's growing in maturity and it's growing in adoption. Now the challenge which Code for Health faced and still faces to an extent, and it's a challenge that other open source software companies face, is there's a lack of understanding about what is open source software, how is it managed, is it insecure, is it individuals in bedrooms coding, and so on and so on. And we're talking about clinical risks with these NHS applications. So a PERTA is this product governance body which manages all this and drives some standards around how these applications don't pass on clinical risk to adopting organisations. So the top row of member A, member B, member C, etc., represents organisations across the NHS. NHS is a sprawling organisation made up of hundreds of hospitals, GP surgeries, and so on and so on. Is how can they be confident these solutions, although they know they work, is there any risk in them? So they created this governance body called a PERTA, and we work with a PERTA on these technical custodianship services. And there's various bits of services, but we focus on what we've already talked about. So as I said, all the source code for these applications will be in the open domain. So if you go onto GitHub, there is an Aperta repository with all the source code for the applications. So what we've been working with the Code for Health team on is how can we get visibility of risk in those applications, and also how can we control that risk. So we worked with them on a policy. We talked about the policy earlier, and we started this work prior to OpenChain. And then for every release that's made available for adoption in the NHS or outside the NHS, we will produce a bill of materials, which will itemize all the components used. It will be time-stamped. At this date and time, there's no known vulnerabilities, and it's complied with the NHS open source policy. And we also provide, on a regular basis, reports to any stakeholders, which are tidied reports, not technical reports, to say in the past 30 days there's been 2 new vulnerabilities, the date developments were made aware of it, the SLA for fixing it, the target date for fixing, and so on and so on. So you get these releases. With the launch of OpenChain, we're on version 1.1, we are taking organisations that supply code to Code for Health and ultimately to the NHS to be OpenChain conformance. So OpenEyes is the first solution, and the developers organisation behind that, ABDHR, we're taking them through conformance. They're about to conform. As I said, there's a case study being written. Now, as you can see, there is this supply chain of software. So there's components and libraries being used by the developers. It's coming into the NHS. The NHS are adopting the solutions and modifying the solutions. So ultimately, what we plan to do is any software supplier supplying open source solutions to the NHS should go through Code for Health and should be overseen by a PERTA. But every solution provider should be OpenChain conformance as one stamp of, yes, there's quality in this code. There's other things related to clinical risk. So there's a 129 standard which they have to be conformant with as well. But it's just another way of demonstrating that. So think about your own businesses in different disciplines. If you want to prove to your customers, to your partners, to your prospective customers, you've got control over, first of all, with OpenChain licensing issues, but you can extend that into security. This is a way of demonstrating that and go through that assessment and achieve OpenChain conformance. From experience, organisations we worked with, they got a lot of business value from this. We find development improves some of their processes. And one of the things that will come out in the case study, the organisation ABEHR, who develop and support and implement OpenEyes, they've been looking for certifications in other areas, like ISO 9001. They've found some of the information that we produce and the training we produce for their developers complement what they're doing in other areas in other standards. And they believe this will help them speed up their sales process when companies start or NHS organisations start evaluating OpenEyes. They can fast track all the issues around quality control, and this is where demonstrating that. Hopefully that makes sense. Just to finish off before I hand over to Fito. So if you want more information about OpenChain, it's openchainprojects.org. There are email aliases you can sign up to. There's bi-weekly conference calls if you wanted to contribute. The training, so you can see what we do with the training, but it's based on the curriculum produced by OpenChain. So we've got this course, Get Right with Open Source, the half day to 3/4 day, depending on whether you do the workshop. You can download the assessment questionnaire, but you can see on our website how we use Trello to be able to enable assessments and basically have a helicopter view and take yourself through a journey from non-conformance to conformance. And the final piece is in the UK, there's an industry association called Open UK. We're working on creating an open chain and a software composition analysis group. So we're going to produce some publications and stuff like that. So you may want to watch that going forward into the future. And with that, I'm going to hand back to Fito.
Thank you, Martin. Okay, so mine just covered obviously the open chain and some of the requirements around what the market is now being sort of driven towards. From a bigger picture, I mean, ultimately, it's an end-to-end solution and an approach that will help you sort of deliver the requirements that yourselves and your partners and supply chains are going to require. Really, it's about selecting the right open source component, tracking that usage of the component. Where are you using it? How much of it are you using it? How do you comply with that component? The licenses, what requirements are being placed upon you and obligations, what vulnerabilities exist within those components, managing those vulnerabilities. How do you manage the vulnerabilities moving forward? How do you make sure that they're patched and they're fixed as they're publicized? And then really, once you sort of got to that point, it's alerting for the future. So if you've got a component today which is license compliant and vulnerability compliant, what happens if a vulnerability is released tomorrow? So it's really keeping a monitoring approach moving forward for alerting on anything that changes, to make sure what you ship is secure and stays secure. So one of our major customers, the use case they've sort of put in place using FlexNet Code Insights is really, from the offset, they set their compliance and standards. What were their rules and regulations? What licenses are permitted and not permitted? What level of security vulnerability is permitted? So depending on the type of organization you're in, depends on what kind of standards you may have to adhere to. And that really drives the behavior around vulnerability management as well. Some policies and standards require certain level of vulnerabilities to be patched and fixed within a certain amount of time. So really, once you know what your compliance standards are and the rules around those, it's scanning your code as early as possible, make sure you inventorize your bill of materials and monitor them going forward, and then have a consistent legal and security review board to constantly monitor that development process from start to finish. And also, once you've got that in place, the ability to actually find an issue and fix it is a lot easier if you know where everything is. So, how to get there? I mean, it's a big challenge and a big sort of a story around sort of the open source governance. But really, it's track, manage, and secure your code. Make sure you know what it is, where it is, and how secure it is. Manage the compliance risk. Make sure there's people in place who know what those risks are. And audits, whether that's internal audits or external audits, really cover the due diligence that's required around that code. Flexera, as an organization, we have one of the most comprehensive knowledge bases with over 13 million components within it. That's the open source element. We have the licenses all associated with those. And the security vulnerability section is empowered by our advisory data from the Security Research Organization, which is part of Flexera, which really assists in the detection and mitigation of the security vulnerability management. So it really helps you prioritize and remediate the vulnerabilities that are detected within your source code to make sure you stay secure moving forward. So how do you sort of build your business case? What is it you really need to identify? So from an IPR impact, identification and control of the source code. Legal infringements. What are the license conditions? What obligations and requirements are being placed upon you for using that open source component? From an impact perspective, if something does go wrong, what's the impact to your organization? Is it financial? Is it reputational? From a security vulnerability, I mean, we know the Equifax story. How damaging could a vulnerability be? And what impact would that have? How's that responded from your customers and your customer service, the brand recognition again? Do your customers sort of trust your organization? Cataloging those components, it helps your development cycle increase speed-wise. You can reuse components. There's a standardization of certain versions, bug-free versions, vulnerability-free versions, and some versions of open source actually change licenses. So really it's understanding what those components are to make sure they're the right ones to be standardized and reused in your organization. And of course, the best code always wins. The better the code, reduces your support calls, support costs, development times, and obviously a number of other factors. So how do you really understand what risks you currently have today? So at Flexera, we offer an open source risk evaluation. This is something we offer for free. Basically, all you really need to do for this, to take advantage of this, is you can email me at pmichael@flexera.com. All I really need from yourselves is a list of open source packages and the version numbers that you have of those. These are the components you would think you use in your organization. What I can then do with that list is push it through our systems, and we'll produce a sort of risk exposure document to yourselves. And you'll see it on the right-hand side here. It basically ranks the components on a license exposure level, so from a priority 1 to 3, based on how strong or copyleft the license is or how permissive it is. From a security vulnerability, how many vulnerabilities we found within those open source packages based on their vulnerability severity. And then we can put a prioritization, so we give you an inventory prioritization around, based on those stats, where do we think we should focus your efforts first moving forward. So any questions on that, by all means, let us know. But all we really need from yourselves is a list of components and the version numbers. You can email them directly to myself. Thank you very much. On that note, I will hand over to Louise.
Thank you very much, Vito. Thank you, Michael. Thank you for that. I have got a list of questions here, so I'll just take those in the order they've come in. So the first question, if I can, this is to go to Martin. Martin, the process that you outlined in your presentation, is this process just for large corporates with lots of developers?
No, definitely not. In fact, the case study that I referenced is for a relatively small organisation, less than 20 developers, and they're getting benefit from this, improving their quality. And in fact, a smaller organisation is more likely to be challenged in proving that credible software solutions. So it'll be quicker and easier for a smaller organisation for sure. But yeah, it is relevant to whatever size of organisation.
Fabulous, thank you. The next question, so as a consumer of proprietary software with open source, like MeanStack, should I put into contracts that the software suppliers provide an OpenChain self-assessment?
I think there's two sides to the equation, and we do some work with purchasing of software for organisations is a way of measuring how well your suppliers manage their software. Now, even a proprietary solution use open source components. There's obligations in there, and the knock-on effect to you if there's a risk in that supply chain is, for instance, legally a cease and desist could be issued for this supplier, which blocks you from using the software. So you definitely just have some metrics, even if they're not OpenChain conformance. What you can do is download the questionnaire. So it's PDF documents, questions that you can ask. So basic questions you can ask your supplier. From that, have you got a policy for managing open source? Do you train your developers? Can you give me a bill of materials, a breakdown of the components used? If they can't answer those basic questions, then they're passing on a risk to you. So definitely you should include it in RFP. A full OpenChain assessment would be a good thing. You can have them self-assess, or you can have it and validate it yourself. So the proof point will be if they answer yes to questions like, we have a policy, can we see your policy? So how do you license your software? How do you manage security and things like that? So definitely, if you're acquiring software, it's a question that's well worth asking.
Thanks, Martin. The next question is for Fito. Fito, how much work is involved with managing open source successfully, and typically by who? So I think that the question is aimed at sort of which departments are most heavily involved with managing open source successfully.
So if you have a process and a policy and possibly a standard in place, it's actually a lot of departments are involved, but the level of effort is actually quite small. So the developers will make sure they're choosing pre-approved components or components that meet the company standards. The legal team may be reviewing things by exception. So if they've already set a policy out, say certain licenses are approved and disapproved, anything different from that is what they would get involved with. And security team, again, they would only get involved in components that have sort of certain level of security vulnerabilities or new vulnerabilities that are detected. So really, it's not a lot of effort if you build this into your day-to-day development process. But really, all departments that are involved from legal, security, architecture, development would be involved on a day-to-day basis. It doesn't take a lot of work to sort of build this up over time to be a common standard in your day-to-day activities.
So it's more about getting the right departments involved and doing the right thing, as opposed to sort of one particular individual or one particular department bearing the whole burden of this.
Absolutely.
Cool. Just one more question, and while we're answering this final question, use the chat function, please. If there's any particular subjects around open source you're not clear on, or you perhaps like us to focus on next time, drop that into the chat function. Equally, if it occurs to you after the webinar, I'll be sending out the deck from this webinar, so just fire an email back to me, and we'll be happy to look into that for future webinars as well. So the final question that we're going to take here, Martin, I think this one will go to you. So this person says, if I'm at a standing start, if I haven't done anything yet in terms of really being serious about managing open source, where do I start? What's a good first step in terms of starting to manage open source as a software supplier?
My recommendation would be training. As I touched on in the presentation, we find there's pockets of knowledge, inconsistent knowledge, misconceptions. Get everybody who's going to be involved into training, so everyone's got a consistent level of understanding about what this is all about. The other thing related to that is a challenge is having developers on board. So if you start this project and don't involve developers, and all of a sudden you come out, we're implementing a policy. Just the word policy gets people's backs up. You could saw it a guideline maybe, but I get involved developers in the process, and we try to engage them and position it as it's improving your development skills. So your next contract or next permanent job, you can go in with these skills and knowledge of how to manage licenses, understanding licenses. So for me, training is the best place to start. And the next one would be just do an assessment against the OpenChain and say, well, where do we stack up? So those two areas really.
Great, thank you. That's great. That's it. So thank you very much, Martin. Thank you, Fito, and thank you to everybody who's watched the webinar today. We hope you found it informative.